Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Quark Hui Lan. Today's guest is Professor Tina Pippin, who teaches Bible and religion at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. In this episode, we'll discuss her newly released book, The Actual Jesus, and the emerging trends of Jesus research. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Pui Lan, for having me on your podcast. I've listened to many episodes that you've done, and they're very useful and instructive and inspiring.
Thank you very much. Congratulations to the publication of the book, The Actual Jesus. I think the audience will wonder, who is this actual Jesus you are talking about?
The book originally started as a series of elemental Jesuses from Earth, Jesus' time in the desert and nature, to air, the ascension of Jesus, especially in the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark, and water, the baptism of Jesus, of course, and fire, the apocalyptic sections and messages of Jesus. And from there, it expanded. I had a lot of material and a lot of film, novels, and material culture, things that I used in my Jesus research. I teach a course, Jesus in History and Culture, to my fabulous students at Agnes Scott, and I've been very influenced by their bringing in popular culture and music and art. And from there, as I was putting together the book, looking for a title, I encountered the Hallow meditation app that the Roman Catholic Church has done. And the actor Jonathan Roumie, who plays Jesus in Dallas Jenkins directed and formulated The Chosen series. And in this advertisement for the meditation app, he encounters a woman who thinks he is the actual Jesus, and he says he's not. She knows he's not, but no one really knows because he plays Jesus. So he's liminally Jesus for a lot of people. And so I deal with the advertising of the meditation app and the Christian influencers that are part of that, including Mark Wahlberg, for example, who also asked Jonathan Roumie in one of the ads, he says, "I'm here with the actual Jesus." So what does that mean? And it got me into the whole quest of the historical Jesuses that I will talk about at some point. But what is the actual Jesus? How do we get back to understand who Jesus was as Jesus lived and taught? That was the foundational question. And as I put together the book, I began to have additional encounters with Jesus, not just in meditation apps and film and novels and that kind of thing, but in artificial intelligence.
What prompted your interest in using films, novels, and even AI, artificial intelligence, to study Jesus? Because other scholars, they primarily work with the text, and they use archaeological methods, sociological methods, and historical and literary methods.
I was trained in the historical critical method. My New Testament professor in college was Dr. James L. Blevins, who was an apocalypse scholar and did a lot with dramatic theory. He had his students perform the Book of Revelation as a 7-act, 7 scenes in each act play, which may or may not be historical, but it works really well. And so the influence of his different pedagogical approaches, plus the very first book as a religious studies major at Mars Hill College, a Southern Baptist college, the very first book I read in his Intro to New Testament class was Rudolf Bultmann's Primitive Christianity. He was a thorough Bultmannian. And so my influence through existentialism, and not only Bultmann, but the Bultmannian students, the post-Bultmannians, Ernst Käsemann, Günter Bornkamm, and others, and their creation of the new quest, whereas Bultmann wanted to find most things not authentic to any kind of original message of Jesus. They wanted to go back and see what could be discovered about Jesus. And from there have been seemingly endless quest trying to discover from the text and archaeology. I'm thinking here in particular of John Dominique Crossan and the Jesus Seminar, that in its first iteration, especially of voting on what was authentic about the Gospels. Did Jesus really say it, or was it from the early church's theological understanding of Jesus? And I had a lot of influences early on as a religious studies major, and then in seminary at a place you taught, Puilan, Candler School of Theology, and then finally at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And I have to say, before the fall to the fundamentalists, we all put BF beside our degrees, where Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where my college professor, Jim Blevins, wound up, and I did my doctoral work with him. It was one of the most creative, free graduate schools, because we had New Testament scholars and as my peers doing process theology and narratology with Alan Culpepper, and with Blevins doing different kinds of literary criticism and interdisciplinary studies. And so I feel very grateful for that time. Of course, it was taken over by Southern Baptist fundamentalists after I was there. And there is a reunion of people from that time, from, I think it's a 40-year reunion they're having at Wake Forest Divinity School very soon, to mourn and reflect and re-envision. That was my background. And so I was interested in Jesus because at Candler School of Theology, the first semester I took Leander Keck's Lives of the Historical Jesus, studying 19th century lives of Jesus, Ernst Renan and Albert Schweitzer, of course, and others, and Strauss and Schleiermacher, and et cetera, et cetera. So I've always been interested in the study of Jesus and following the different waves of that. I did a special study over the summer when I was in college on the quest of the historical Jesus. And I'm still learning. I'm still reading those material. Does what I have found as a postmodernist and deconstructive scholar, which means opening up to the possibilities of the text, not trying to pin the text down, but entering into more creative conversations with the text and inside and outside the text in terms of its reception and afterlives. And so I found myself engaged in searching for this Jesus of the Gospels. And I think there are Jesuses in the Gospels, different ones, but for different gospel writers, that I could find a lot in novels and film and music and art. And the representations are out there. And we encounter Jesus in so many ways. And now, in this current time of artificial intelligence and newer Jesus films, the series of The Chosen, and other Jesus and Jesus adjacent films that continue to be produced. We encounter Jesus in so many ways, and how to sort through that was one of my goals in this book.
As you know that, the Jesus Seminar and the different historical quests, they have produced different images for Jesus as eschatological prophet, as a healer or miracle worker or revolutionary or Jewish reformer. I think the audience will be very interested to know, are there particular images from your book, actual Jesus, they might not have heard before?
Yes, there are some, especially through film, because I teach film studies. And one of the films that most people would not have heard of is called The New Gospel, directed by Martin Rau, who is a Swiss-Belgium film director. And I'll give this as an example. He went to Matera, Italy, where most of the Jesus films are filmed, because part of old Matera looks like ancient Jerusalem. And Mel Gibson's The Passion, the Book of Clarence was also filmed there. And of course, Paolo Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew in 1964. So Martin Rau went to Matera to do a remake of Pasolini's film. And when he got there, he was looking for local actors like Pasolini used in his film. And he was surprised to encounter African asylum seekers who worked on mafia-run tomato farms, and the whole worker-driven movement that they had started for their human rights and for their asylum in Italy and fair wages. And so he discovers them in their slum situation, and the main activist plays Jesus. And so the film is a hybrid film. It's part documentary, part this passion play that he puts together. And you can see, even as he's filming the passion play with some professional actors and some local Matera citizens, and there are tourists in the background with their cell phones. It's quite an experience. And when they're filming the trial with Pilate, the way that Raul does it is to show the crowd, that includes tourists, and the local Matera citizens dressed in costume. And there's a local priest there. When he encounters the Jesus actor, who is one of the tomato farm workers, the main activist, he hugs him. He knows he's not Jesus, but he is Jesus. I look for those spaces of liminality where everyone knows that's not Jesus, he's an actor, or he's a farm worker. Then during that scene, because the Jesus actor is a Cameroonian asylum seeker, when Pilate asked the crowd, who should I release, Barabbas or Jesus? The crowd yells, kill the filthy black, which is stunning and points to the xenophobia and the issues that are having to be dealt with in Italy right now and a lot of other places, Black Lives Matter. And I think those encounters with not the white Jesus and the Jesus who is really on the margins of society as a refugee, as a farm worker, this is where liberation readings come into play. That's where I want to look for Jesus, in war and refugee camps and nuclear situations like in South Georgia, to find Jesus in solidarity with the marginalized, working for social change. And that takes me in, through, outside, and in, and all of the above in my reading of the Gospels.
You identify yourself as a scholar activist in the book, and certainly you brought in the issues of women and, of course, Black Lives Matter, and also your concern about the immigrants and what is happening in the United States and around the world. Do you think that as a biblical scholar and also someone studying religion, there is certain ethics of interpretation? That is, for you, for example, you just said you have taken on a more liberationist, emancipatory reading.
I think that's central, and it's always up for critique and question. I think those of us who do liberationist hermeneutics or interpretation from privileged positions, even if some of our positions are not as privileged, that we have to hold ourselves accountable or mutually accountable with others. There are films that are Jesus-centered and those that are Jesus adjacent, as they're called, Life of Brian, Book of Clarence, that I find really useful to help me unpack my own feeling about who Jesus is. I'm a big Jesus film nerd. I like Godspell. I like Last Temptation of Christ. I like Jesus films. Greatest story ever told. I really like Jesus films. And when I saw the Book of Clarence, the very first day it came out at the theater, I walked out and I thought, I have no idea what just happened, but I liked it. And I think film can get us to a place, and novels also, that the gospel texts can too if we allow them to, but we have a lot of templates on top of those texts because of our own adherence to certain kinds of methodologies or whatever. And I've done a lot of work in fantasy literature, especially with the Apocalypse of John, also horror literature, because of the violence of the fantastic vision in that book. I think seeing the Gospels as not historically, and this is Boltmanian, as myth, but also as fiction and fantasy, because these are not historical biographies in my mind. They're different interpretations of first century communities about this teacher and prophet, and for the gospel writers, also God man, son of God. And so where do we in the 21st century find this Jesus? I think a lot of different places. I need a bracelet that says WWAJD. What would the actual Jesus do? Because when we say Jesus, what are we really saying? We all have something in our minds. If psychologists are right, the kind of white tanning bed Jesus picture, the head of Christ in our minds, or some white, long, flowing, highlighted locks, hot Jesus in some of the films, or a Jesus who is rather stiff and repeating sayings like in the Greatest Story Ever Told, or in The Chosen, a more low Christology or doctrine of Christ Jesus that laughs and gets in water fights in the river with his disciples. So there's this range of how we see, and we all come to the text with these certain visions of Jesus, and Jesus has a certain voice, and certain teachings affect us more than others. I have to say, when I walked out of the book of Clarence, one of the first things that really hit me was that Jesus in that film did not preach against slavery, as in the entire New Testament. And the Clarence character, who was a ne'er-do-well, grifter, smoke pot all the time guy, he put his life on the line. He gave up his life in an anti-slavery movement. And these films can really have an effect on us. And Jesus' novels, The Last Temptation of Christ, Nikos Kazantzakis' novel, there are just so many. Or the film Son of Man, which I use in my Bible and Liberation class, the South African film from 2009, is phenomenal. It shows a Black Jesus, working class or below, who gathers disciples from his own South African, or in the film, like unnamed African country, dealing with a military dictatorship that is sponsored by the settler colonial, probably British because they speak English, community that is in cahoots with the dictatorship. And what that film does with the role of women, it's not just Jesus, but those around Jesus. And I think The Chosen really is more traditional and has a certain agenda in these current political times. Acted, produced, however, a more conservative viewpoint. And I think some of the films that take real chances, the ones that get boycotted, like Life of Brian, you can really enter into the Jesus story in some real creative ways. And so even films that aren't Jesus, like Jordan Peele's Us, and that's seen as a bit of a stretch, but it's because of questions that I had as a lifetime Episcopalian. And that film raised those questions for me.
Tina, as I am also Episcopalian, and I am just wondering, because in our tradition, the Anglican tradition, we have not been taught to look at the Bible as if it's self-evident. There is always tradition and wisdom, isn't it? So would that have affected your own interpretation of the Bible?
Yes. I remember I grew up in eastern North Carolina, a very small town. When I was in second grade, the priest and his wife was asked to leave because they tried to integrate the church. This was in the early 60s. So my feelings about race are really heavily tied to that, because my godparents took the side of the priest and his wife and some others in the church. My parents, a different tact on that. And so when I was about 5 years old or 6, I was in a Sunday school class led by, I think, the guy who owned the heating and air conditioning business in town. And he was doing the Adam and Eve in the garden story with us. And he said to us, because we were all confused about the story, and he said, just think of it like a fairy tale. And that really opened my eyes. Oh, okay, that makes sense. And so I never took it literally. And I don't really know, even though I was in college with Southern Baptist peers who did take it literally, that I never knew what that meant, especially the more I did Greek and Hebrew. It's like, which text and which interpretation, and how culturally and intersectionally loaded those interpretations are, including mine. And so I just wanted to expose or make more transparent how we approach Jesus research.
I also want to ask, how do you teach your students about the Bible? You might use films and many other pedagogies.
It depends on the course. I do 3 Bible courses. This fall, I'm teaching the politics of apocalypse again, and I taught it last fall during the election. So it is a film studies course, as is my Jesus in History and Culture course. So I do use a lot of film. We also look at millennial movements and current political situations, especially around Christian nationalism, Zionism. However, in my Bible and Liberation class, we are connected with an organization directly across the street from the college, Decatur Cooperative Ministry, that is an interfaith ministry for unhoused families. And they have a 5-bedroom unit called Hagar's House. So students do a 10-hour practicum there. We study homelessness and poverty in Atlanta, work with the Georgia Poor People's Campaign. I also bring in an immigration refugee activist from Casa Alterna. They have done a lot of work at Stewart Detention Center. So we're in Georgia. So I want to use the context of where we are, which is unfortunately very rich in terms of human rights abuses. And what does the Bible have to say in these times and public facing? And we also, in that Bible and Liberation course, read Phyllis Tribble's Text of Terror. I am at a historic women's college. That book works really well at an intro level. I can't do Bible without paying attention to the political and cultural context I'm in of my students and what's right outside the campus and also inside, in terms of we pay our facilities, dining hall, landscapers, etc., sub-poverty wages, and they're mostly Black and brown since the college began. And even though facility staff over 50 years ago formed the first unionized facilities workers in the South, some incredible women. And so we are of a place. It's a place-based hermeneutic or interpretive process. So back to my Jesus course. Last spring, when I taught the Jesus course, I had 16 students and we did film, and they brought in things happened during the semester that were new. And we read a lot of traditional and new material. And at the end of the semester, when they did their final presentations, I was very surprised to hear them say, "This course strengthened my faith," which is an academic religious studies course. Even though my college is Presbyterian founded, we're loosely affiliated. So I was surprised by that. And even students who came in as agnostic or atheist or used to be Methodist but no more, or Catholic or whatever, said they grew closer to Jesus. And I think that wasn't anything I did, really. I think hopefully we gave each other room to explore in a safe and bold space. That's the best case scenario on that. But it did surprise me because the course was not about faith. It was not a seminary course or a theological course, even though, of course, we did do Christology a bit, like on atonement and those things. And the course was heavily feminist and not just a little bit Marxist. And so we used, the main text was a Marxist book, Robert Miles and James Crossley's book. So to answer your question there, you don't know what's going to happen, but the Jesus story opens itself up to a lot of possibilities. And unfortunately, we're seeing how those are enacted in Washington, D.C. right now.
As you look back to your distinguished career, Tina, would you say that the studies of the Bible has greatly expanded not only because of the different interdisciplinary methods, but more people, the womanists, the people of color, those who have been colonized from the global south, and of course the LGBT colleagues. And so they ask different questions and brought to the Bible their different concerns.
Yes. Even if I started at a Southern Baptist College with Bultmannian exegesis or ways of interpreting the text, the promise of the historical critical method was laid out at the time, and this would have been the mid-1970s, as, okay, eventually, you keep plugging at it, you keep doing language, word studies, and archaeology, and text studies, and you're going to get more and more closer to some kind of capital T truth. And I found that promise was not going to ever be fulfilled, and that the small t truths were much more important and much more interesting. And so what I've saw from historical critical method broadening out, even though I think the future of the discipline and of the Society of Biblical Literature is in what scholars like you and Gail Yee and Aaron Runyons, Lynn Huber, George Eichley, Richard Walsh, and Talking Film Studies, and Stephen Moore and Benny Liu. And there's so many folks out there doing contextual interpretation and pushing the boundaries of that and asking the really insightful, hard ethical questions that go along with them. I'll give you one example that just is hopefully going to materialize. In my Jesus course, I used a segment of this playwright, actress, artist, Jo Clifford, who wrote the play Jesus, Queen of Heaven. Is a trans activist playwright. And one of my friends, a retired UCC minister in town, knows Jo, and we're through the feminist bookstore, Karis Books and More. That's now the campus bookstore, thank goodness, across the street from Agnes Scott. We're hoping to bring Jo to Atlanta in the spring to do a performance of Jesus, Queen of Heaven. In terms of queer theory and trans rights, and I think this is all where the future is of the discipline. And you can still go to the annual Society of Biblical Literature meeting, and there is the Q consultation, the Q being a hypothetical document shared by Mark and Luke. And I teach that in my classes because it's important to part of the history, and who knows if it existed or not. But it does make a lot of sense and in some ways. And so there's very traditional stuff happening. And then there's the separate LGBTQ group and the womanist interpretations and the Asian Pacific Islander. And I think the center, as it's been white male, Eurocentric, is not going to hold much longer. And that is a wonderful thing to happen, I think, in the future. And you look at our politics right now and you think, oh, no, who knows what's going to happen. But I think in our discipline, there's no going back. They can try to rein it in and have their authoritarian death grip on the Gospels and the Book of Revelation, which really scares me because that is a death grip.
Yes, indeed. I certainly hope that the AR will be even more diverse, welcoming different perspectives. Tina will be the president of this Society of Biblical Literature, the world's largest association of biblical scholars. What are your hopes for your organization?
I was just in Sweden at the International Society of Biblical Literature this summer, and also the European Association of Biblical Studies. They did a joint session. And just the global extent and diversity and knowledges that are brought, that I hope that becomes the way you study, and those things cannot be ignored in scholarship and have to be paid attention to. There's a lot of feminist, womanist hope because it's still pretty much male-dominated society. But I am joyous that Cheryl Kirk-Dugan, who was retired from Shaw Divinity School, and I wound up, not intentionally, but co-editing 2 volumes with Fortress Press of Dr. Randall C. Bailey, a preeminent international Hebrew Bible scholar who taught at Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. One volume of his collected essays where he showed the process of African American biblical interpretation, and then a second volume of conversations with that and how he pushed the boundaries of how to read the Hebrew Bible. I've known him 40 years. We were at Candler School of Theology together in a Cohn, Bart, and Tillich seminar, my very first class at Candler, and got in a wild debate and have been friends ever since. And so I'm very happy to be able to have the experience of seeing how African American biblical interpretation is continuing to unfold and how Randall Bailey was a pioneer in that field. I feel very honored to be part of that conversation.
Thank you very much for doing this important work. As I know and also respect Dr. Randall Bailey's work, I look forward to seeing those 2 volumes in print. And thank you very much for joining the podcast. If you like this particular episode, please click comment and subscribe so more people will know about this Quack and Roll podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Poilan.